The auctioneer's gavel had barely fallen when the laughter started, and Marta Kellerman stood in the county courthouse with a receipt for 55 acres in her hand, and the whole room deciding, out loud, that she was a fool. The land was a green scar on the edge of the valley, a hillside so choked with poison ivy that no man had walked it in 20 years, and she had bought it for $118 in back taxes, because no one else would put up a dime. What none of them knew, what none of them could have guessed as they filed out into the October cold, shaking their heads at the widow who had thrown away good money on worthless dirt, was that 11 months later, a stranger from the city would stand on that same hillside with tears in his eyes, and that a thing everyone in the valley had forgotten existed would be pulled back into the light by the patient, ridiculous work of 40 goats. But that is the end of the tale, and a tale told backward loses its bones. Let us go to the beginning. 2 springs before the laughter in the courthouse, Marta Kellerman's husband had gone into the ground behind the little Lutheran church, and Marta had learned in a single winter how quickly a valley forgets a woman once her man is gone. Henrik had left her the small house on the eastern road, a debt at the feed store, and 40 acres of thin pasture that grew rock better than it grew hay. She was 41 years old, broad in the shoulder from a lifetime of work, quiet in a way that people mistook for slowness, and she had no children to help her and no brother to speak for her. The men of the valley did not hate her. It was gentler and worse than hate. They pitied her, and pity, Marta had come to understand, was just contempt wearing its Sunday coat. When she went to the bank in the town of Corliss to ask about the debt, the manager spoke to her the way a man speaks to a child who has wandered into his office, slow and loud and kind, and she left with nothing but the certainty that a woman alone was not expected to hold what she had, let alone gain more. It was old Emil Vasco who first put the notion in her head, though he would never have called it a notion. Emil was the oldest man on the Eastern Road, a Slovak who had come across the water as a boy with nothing but a wooden trunk and a way of looking at land that the American-born farmers never quite had. His farm was small and poor by the valley's reckoning, but Emil never went hungry, and Emil never owed a man $1, and Marta had noticed, the way she noticed most things without saying so, that the two facts might be connected. He kept goats when everyone else kept cattle. He grew things in the shade of his fence rows that the others cut down as weeds. When Marta brought him a jar of her plum preserves that first lonely spring, he sat her down at his table and said, in his slow graveled English, that a person who could see worth where others saw only trouble would never starve. Land is not rich or poor. Marta, land is only waiting for the right eyes. She had turned that over in her mind all the long walk home, and it had not left her since. So when the county posted the tax auction that autumn, and she saw the parcel listed, 55 acres on the north slope of Hollis Hill, delinquent 9 years, minimum bid the sum of the owed taxes, she did not laugh the way the others did. She walked out to the edge of that ruined hillside on a gray afternoon, and she stood at the fence line and she looked. And what everyone else saw was a green horror, a solid wall of poison ivy grown up the slope, higher than a man's head, thick as a hedge, swallowing the old fence posts and the stone walls, and whatever had once stood among them, a place that itched to look at, and blistered to touch. But Marta Kellerman did not see a curse. She thought of Emil's goats and how she had watched them strip a bramble patch to bare earth in a week and grow fat doing it, their strange sideways eyes bright with contentment, and how the old man had told her that a goat could eat what would poison a cow or a man and take no hurt from it at all. And she thought, there is more feed on that hillside than on my 40 acres of rock. It is only feed no one else can use, and a thing that no one else can use, she thought, can be had for almost nothing. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was good. She told no one what she was thinking. She banked it low, like a coal under ash, and she went to the courthouse with $118 she could barely spare. The bidding, if you could call it that, lasted the length of a held breath. The auctioneer read out the parcel, described the location, and a snicker went through the room before he had finished. Someone said, loud enough to be meant to be heard, that you'd do better to buy the fever itself and skip the middleman. When Marta raised her hand and stated the minimum, the auctioneer looked at her twice to be sure she understood what she was doing and asked her, not unkindly, whether she knew what grew on that ground. "I know exactly what grows on it," she said. And that was all she said. The gavel fell. And then came the laughter I told you of, and the walk to the clerk's desk with every eye on her back, and the receipt in her raw hand, and a man named Cyrus Doyle standing by the door in a good wool coat, watching her with an expression that was not laughing at all. Doyle was the land agent for the mining concern that had been quietly buying up the north end of the valley, and Doyle did not laugh at anything that had just changed hands. But Marta did not know his name yet, and she went home that evening tired and stung by the day and lay awake doing the arithmetic again in the dark, and it still came out right, and that was enough to let her sleep. The work began, the way all real work begins, which is to say, slowly, and with the body. Marta had 2 goats of her own, and Emil sold her 6 more on terms that were more gift than sale, and she took the last of her egg money and bought 14 head at the fall stock sale from a man in the next county who was glad to be rid of scrubby animals no cattleman wanted. That gave her 22 goats to start, and Emil came the first morning to help her mend the fence along the bottom of Hollis Hill, and he stood at the base of that green wall and put his hands on his hips and laughed, but it was a different laughter than the courthouse kind. It was the laughter of a man, seeing a good joke told at the world's expense. "They will eat like kings," he said, "and they will do your clearing for free and grow meat and milk while they do it, and leave the ground behind them, richer than they found it. You have not bought poison, Marta. You have bought a table already set." Then he grew serious and taught her the things she needed to know. How to move the goats in a tight bunch behind a woven wire so they grazed one strict to the dirt before moving on. How to give them shade and clean water and salt, how to watch for the ones who sickened, how to read the slope so the animals did the work of clearing in the order that served her. She listened the way she did everything without wasted words, and she remembered all of it. They turned the first goats loose into the first fenced strip on a bright morning in November, and Marta stood at the fence and watched, and what she saw she would remember all her life. The animals hit that poison ivy like it was the finest clover ever grown. They stood on their hind legs to reach the high runners. They stripped the leaves, and then the vines, and then chewed the woody stems down to nubs, working shoulder to shoulder, tails flicking, utterly content, taking not the slightest hurt from the thing that would have blistered any human hand to the bone. By the end of that first short day they had opened a bare brown patch in the green wall the size of her kitchen floor. And Marta walked into that cleared patch, into ground no person had trod in a generation, and she stood there in the raw November air and felt something she had not felt since Henrik died, which was the plain animal satisfaction of a plan meeting the world and holding. She said nothing to anyone in town. When the feed store man asked her, half smiling, how the poison farm was coming, she said it was coming along, and let him make of that what he liked. The coal stayed banked. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it, and Marta had no need to hand the valley the pleasure of being proven right before its time. The winter was hard, as valley winters were, and Marta learned the true cost of what she had taken on. A goat is a delicate animal in the cold, and a clever one in every season, and she lost 2 head to the weather, and 1 to a dog that got into the fold, and she spent nights in the barn with a lantern, and a sick doe pressed against her chest, doing the sums again in her head. Always the sums. So many goats, so much feed, so much hillside, so many strips a week. She figured that at the rate the herd was clearing, and with the kids the does would drop come spring, she would eat through the whole 55 acres in something under 2 years, and by then the herd would be 4 or 5 times its size, and the milk alone, made into the sharp white cheese Emil had taught her to press, would clear Henrik's debt at the feed store and leave her standing on her own feet for the first time in her widowed life. It was a good arithmetic, but arithmetic on paper and arithmetic in the mud are 2 different animals. and there were mornings that winter when she stood in the freezing barn, with her hands cracked and bleeding, and wondered whether the valley had been right about her after all. Then she would remember Emil's words, "Land is only waiting for the right eyes," and she would go back to the work, because the work was the only answer she had to the doubt, and it was answer enough. By April, the does dropped their kids, 40-odd new goats staggering on new legs in the spring mud, and Marta's herd doubled almost overnight, and the pace of the clearing doubled with it. Now, when she looked up at Hollis Hill, she could see real change, a widening apron of open ground creeping up the slope, brown, and then, as the spring rains came, greening over with grass and clover that had been buried under the poison for 20 years, and had only been waiting for the light. That was the thing the valley never understood about that hillside. The ivy had not made the land poor. The ivy had been a blanket, and under the blanket the old pasture soil was still there, deep and dark and rested, richer for its long sleep. And as the goats peeled the blanket back, foot by foot, the good ground came up underneath like a memory returning. Marta began to sell the first cheese in Corliss that spring, and a woman at the market tasted it and bought all of it and asked for more, and word of the sharp white cheese from the Poison Farm began to travel in a way that the word of the Poison Farm never had, quietly, from kitchen to kitchen ahead of Marta herself. It was in June that the goats reached the thing that changed the story. Marta had them working a strip high on the slope, near the crown of the hill where the ivy had grown thickest and oldest, and she came up one evening to move the fence and found the herd, clustered around something in the cleared ground, nosing at it, and she pushed through them and stopped where she stood. The goats had eaten the ivy down off the face of a building. It was a cabin, an old log cabin, small and square and low, its logs gone silver gray with age, its chimney of river stones still standing, its door hung on a leather hinge gone to powder. The ivy had swallowed it so completely that it had become invisible, a green mound among green mounds, and now the goats had unwrapped it the way a person unwraps a gift, and it sat there in the last of the daylight, patient and whole, waiting to be found. Marta put her hand on the cold logs and felt the axe marks still in them, the marks of a man's hands from long before her time, and something in her went very still. She asked Emil about it, and Emil went quiet, in a way she had never seen, and then he told her what the old ones of the valley knew and the young ones had forgotten. That cabin was the first house in the whole valley. It had been built by the first family to settle that ground, near 70 years before the Hollis family, for whom the hill was named, and they had cleared and farmed and buried their dead on that north slope until a fever took the last of them in a bad summer, and after that, the land had gone to the county, and the poison ivy had come up over it, and the valley, in the way that valleys do, had decided it was easier to forget the place than to remember what had happened there. But it was not worthless ground, Emil said, and it never had been. It was the founding ground. And a thing does not stop being what it is, only because men have agreed to forget it. Marta walked the cleared crown of the hill in the long June evening, and found the old stone walls the goats had bared, and the caved cellar, and the little graveyard with its leaning field stones, and she understood that she had not bought 55 acres of poison. She had bought the beginning of the valley, and no one had known it, least of all her. Now here I must tell you of Cyrus Doyle, the man in the good wool coat, because it was in that same summer that he came up the eastern road in a shining black automobile and stepped out at Marta's gate as though he were doing her a favor by soiling his boots on her ground. He was smooth as poured cream, all warmth and concern, and he told her he represented interests that were developing the North Valley, and that he had heard, with real sympathy, that a woman alone was struggling to hold a difficult piece of land, and that he was prepared to take the whole burden off her hands. He named a figure, $400. More than triple what she had paid, he pointed out. A handsome profit for a poor widow, and surely she could see that 55 acres of such rough country was more than any one woman could ever hope to manage. Marta listened to all of it with her hands folded, and she noticed, the way she noticed everything, two things. She noticed that Doyle's eyes kept lifting past her to the crown of Hollis Hill, where the cleared ground and the old cabin now stood plain against the sky. And she noticed that he was in a great hurry for a man buying worthless land. She told him she would think on it, and she watched his automobile go back down the road. And that night she went to Emil and laid it out, and the old man's face darkened. "The mining concern," he said. "They do not want your poison ivy, Marta. They want what is under it. There is coal in the North Slope. Everyone has always known it. That is why the concern has been buying every parcel on this end of the valley for 2 years. Your 55 acres sits in the middle of their map like a missing tooth, and they cannot dig around you. And so, this Doyle comes with his soft voice and his $400, which is nothing, which is an insult because he is certain. A woman alone cannot know what she is standing on." And Marta, who by then had cleared the founding ground of the valley, with her own herd and her own hands, felt the last of her old smallness burn away, and in its place came something hard and calm and clear. She did not sell. She went instead to the County Historical Society in Corliss, 3 quiet ladies in a room full of yellowed papers, and she told them what her goats had uncovered on Hollis Hill, and she brought one of them out to see the Hollis cabin standing in its ring of cleared earth. And that lady, who had spent her life mourning the valley's forgotten past, wept at the sight of it and said it was the most important building in the county and that it must be saved. And Marta, who was learning at last to speak, said quietly that it stood on her land and that she would see it saved, and that no mining concern would ever put a shovel through the graves of the family that had begun the whole valley. The Historical Society took up the cause. Word went out. And here the fortune of the valley began to invert, for the same men who had laughed in the courthouse now had to reckon with the fact that the poison farm was not poison at all, but the birthplace of everything they were, and that the widow they had pitied had saved it while they slept. But the true test, the one that decided everything, came at the end of that summer, and it came the way such things come, from the sky. The rains that had greened Marta's hillside stopped in July and did not return. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, and the valley's creeks dropped, and then the wells began to fail, and the corn that the cattlemen had staked their year on curled and browned and died standing in the fields, and the pastures went to dust, and the cattle that could not eat dust began to starve. It was the worst drought the valley had known in 30 years, and it fell hardest on exactly the men who had mocked her, the cattlemen with their thirsty herds and their scorched acres. Hunger changes a valley. By the 3rd week of August, there were proud men on the eastern road who did not know how they would feed their stock through the winter, and their pride was a terrible thing to watch, because it had nowhere left to stand. And Marta Kellerman, on the north slope of Hollis Hill, was not in trouble at all. Her goats did not need corn. Her goats ate brush, and the north slope still had brush, and what was more, the deep old founding soil she had uncovered held its moisture in the drought, where the thin, overworked valley bottoms baked to brick. She had grass when no one else had grass. She had milk when the cattle had gone dry. She had, in the middle of the valley's worst year, more feed on her scorned acres than the proudest cattleman had on his best, and the arithmetic that had once been a private hope was now, suddenly, a public fact that no man could laugh away. The first to come to her gate was a neighbor named Alden First, who had stood in the courthouse the autumn before, and said the loudest of the mocking things, and who now stood at her fence with his hat in his hands, and his face gray with shame and hunger, and asked, in a voice that cost him everything to use, whether she had any feed he might buy for his last dozen cows. And here, listener, is the whole heart of the tale, the moment the story had been walking toward from the courthouse to the cabin to the drought. For Marta could have named any price she liked. She held the only green ground in a starving valley. The men who had pitied her were at her mercy, and a smaller soul would have squeezed them dry, and no one would even have blamed her for it. She stood at the fence and looked at Alden First for a long moment, and she thought of every laugh she had swallowed, and then she thought of Emil at his table saying that a person who could see worth where others saw only trouble would never starve, and she understood that being right is its own kind of reply, and that a fortune built on a neighbor's ruin is not a fortune, but a debt. She named a fair price, not a charity, for she was not a fool, and a thing given free is a thing not valued. But a fair price, a decent, honest price. The price she would have wanted paid to her, and she told first. He could cut brush from the lower slope himself and haul it, and pay her at the end of the winter when he had it, and she shook his hand on it, and first went home and told what she had done, and the next day there were 3 more men at her gate, and by the week's end, the eastern road had worn a path to Hollis Hill, and Marta Kellerman fed the valley's cattle through the drought, from the very acres the valley had called worthless, and she did it at prices no man could call anything but generous. And the laughter of the courthouse was gone from the valley as though it had never been. Cyrus Doyle came one last time, in the cool of September, his automobile dusty now, his voice a little less like poured cream. He raised his offer. $800, he said, and let the number sit. Then 12. Then, when her face did not change, he made his mistake. The mistake such men always make when they think they are the only clever one in the room. He said, leaning close, that she was being unwise, that the concern knew there was better than $400 of coal under that north slope, and that she'd never get such a chance again. And Marta, who had told no one what she suspected, said quietly, so you have known about the coal all along. Doyle's mouth opened and shut. He had confirmed with his own greed the very thing he had come to hide. Marta straightened up. This land, she said, is the founding ground of this valley, and there is a family buried on it, and a house on it older than any other for 40 miles. And it belongs now to the county's history, and to me, and it will never be dug. You may tell your concern that the widow knew exactly what she was standing on, and she opened the gate for him to leave. The Historical Society made the Hollis cabin a protected landmark that autumn, and it was a man from the state capitol, a scholar of old buildings, who stood on the crown of the hill in the slanting light and put his hand on those silver logs and wept. The stranger from the city I promised you at the very start. He said he had read of the cabin in the oldest county records and believed it lost forever, and that its saving was a thing the whole state would remember. Marta stood beside him in the wind, with her 40-odd goats grazing peacefully across the ground they had unwrapped, and she did not gloat, because gloating was never in her, but she let herself feel, quietly and fully, the plain, deep satisfaction of a thing done right against the whole weight of everyone who had said it could not be done. The drought broke in October, 2 springs to the month after the gavel fell, and the valley came slowly back to life, and the men who had laughed at Marta Kellerman now tipped their hats to her on the eastern road and meant it. Her cheese sold in 3 counties. Her herd grew. The debt at the feed store was paid in full and forgotten, and on the crown of Hollis Hill, the old cabin stood clear in the sun, with the good grass green around it, and the goats moving through it like a slow tide, and travelers came out from Corliss on Sundays to see the founding house of the valley that a widow's goats had pulled back into the light. Emil Vasco lived to see it, and he came out one last spring evening and sat on a stump by the cabin with Marta beside him, and he looked at the whole living hillside and he said, "Land is not rich or poor, Marta. Land is only waiting for the right eyes." And this time it was not a lesson, but a truth confirmed, spoken by an old man to the one person in the valley who had proven it, and Marta Kellerman, who had bought 55 acres of poison for $118 and been laughed out of a courthouse, sat on the founding ground of everything and knew at last, and for good, exactly what she was standing on.